Hi, and welcome to our Week 5 lecture, where I'm going to go over some of the basics of survey research. Like any kind of research methodology, there are advantages and disadvantages to doing survey research. The advantage is that you can typically ask about private feelings, thoughts, and behaviors that you may not observe in an experiment. For example, if you want to ask about people's sexual behaviors, that's not necessarily something you would construct an experiment around, but you could ask about those behaviors through a survey that gives people more privacy in their responses. The disadvantage is that you cannot guarantee that respondents are honest. And one way you can increase honesty would be to be careful about the phrasing of your items so that your questions don't trigger people to be dishonest or to associate something negative with their answers. If survey research is done rigorously and with large samples, you can predict attitudes or behavior. So you can predict how people might behave based on the associations you find in a survey. Survey research is also quantitative, which means that you can summarize large chunks of data into averages, percentages, and so you can understand the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of a large group of people and condense it down into trends. Surveys are also easily replicable because it's usually just a series of different measures that are given to a particular sample. Other disadvantages is that you could get a low response rate. So if people do not take your survey, then you have no data to analyze and summarize. Another limitation is that surveys are typically closed-ended questions, and you can't edit them after the fact. So if your questions aren't worded clearly and properly, people may not understand your questions, which means you're not going to get valid and reliable responses to use. Also, the people taking your survey have to have some understanding of the topic in order to answer your questions. You're not going to be there to clarify, to explain. So they have to already have an understanding of what you're going to ask them about. Also, survey research is typically cross-sectional, meaning it's given at one point in time. So while there are longitudinal surveys, typically surveys just go out once, which makes it harder to use them to determine cause and effect or to predict behaviors. There are 4 different types of surveys and types of methods you could use to collect survey data. 2 are interview and 2 are questionnaire. So you could interview people in person, where a trained interviewer goes to someone's home or someone comes to a lab. The benefit there is that you can establish rapport with the person you're interviewing, so you may be more likely to get honest answers or in-depth answers. You also can probe. So if a response is unclear, there are follow-up questions that can be asked. The cost to this is the labor of training interviewers, paying them to interview, and travel if they're going to people's homes to interview them. The bias in the sample is that you're typically going to get only a local sample where the interviewers can travel to someone's home or the participant can come to the lab. You can also interview people over the telephone. Some of you may have participated in a telephone interview. The benefit to this, again, is that you can probe, so you can ask follow-up questions for clarity. However, people may be suspicious of a telephone interviewer, thinking that maybe it's a telemarketer or there's a sales component to it. The cost here is the labor of training and paying the interviewer. And the bias to your sample is that everyone you interview must have a telephone in order to be included. And previously, it used to be that everybody had to have a landline because that is how numbers are randomly generated. But I doubt that that's the same now because that would also limit your sample. 2 kinds of questionnaires that you can use. One is through the mail and one would be through the internet. The benefits to both are that they are anonymous. The downside is that you can't probe. So in neither situation can you ask follow-up questions. So the responses you get are the responses you get. However, you may be more likely to get responses about sensitive topics because it is an anonymous format. The cost to a mailed questionnaire would be the paper, envelopes, stamps, wherein there's very low cost to an internet questionnaire. The cost of the survey software, which can be cheap, and also if you work at a university or an institution, is probably provided by your institution. And then sometimes if you choose to promote it through a survey bank, then you will incur the cost of paying your participants to take your survey. The bias introduced with the questionnaire through the mail is that through both, is that people have to be able to read. And the bias through the internet questionnaire is that people have to have access to the internet. You'll notice that no matter what type of survey research you do, there is always a bias to your sample. And if you haven't noticed yet, there's a theme in this class, which is that there is always bias in research methods. There is no type of research that does not have some form of bias or subjectivity. So here are the basics of designing a survey study. As with any research project, first you have to define your research question. What is it that you want to know? A research question is typically broad, like how does therapist experience affect therapeutic alliance? Whereas survey questions are very narrow and attempt to get at different aspects of this broader question. You have to determine what type of survey you'll use or how you'll collect your data, which we just discussed on the previous slide. And this is determined based on the purpose of your study, your research questions, the population being studied, the resources that you have available. It's much more common to do questionnaires than it is to do interviews. However, larger research studies, larger national studies, may have the funds and the need to do in-person or phone interviews. Once you have your research question and you've determined the best way to collect your data, then you write the survey. So there are several things to consider when you're putting together a survey. How long does it need to be? And how long should it be? So there's really a balance to be struck here between asking questions to get at all of the variables you're interested in, and then making a survey that is so long people don't want to take it or people don't finish it. So there's a balance here, and some people find that balance and some people don't. If your survey is too short, you may not wind up with enough information to even test your hypotheses or run an analysis. And if your survey is very long, you may not get a lot of respondents, or you may get responder fatigue where they only finish half your survey. Something to think about is how you can increase a respondent's interest in the survey. So how interested is somebody going to be in taking your survey? So this can influence how you title it, also where you market it or where you promote your survey based on how interested you think people will be. When you're constructing a survey, you should think about funneling, which means you ask your most general questions first, and then you get to the more specific. This primes people to start thinking about the topics that you're asking about before you get into some of the nitty-gritty, where if you put those questions first, they may not even be mentally in the place to think about those questions. Formatting, editing is always important with a survey. You want it to be clear and organized without mistakes. Also, you should always pilot a survey. So if you design a survey, have 5 or 10 different people take it and tell you if it made sense, if there were issues, if they didn't know how to answer certain questions. Also have them tell you how long it took them to take the survey, and then you have a sense for how long it will take, and then you can tell your participants that. Because the data you collect in a survey study is based on people's responses to your questions, it is very important to ask good questions. There are 2 kinds of questions that we can ask. You may be familiar with this idea: open-ended questions and closed-ended questions. The benefits to open-ended questions are that participants can respond in any way they like. So if one of your predetermined responses doesn't fit, here they get to tell you in their own words what their response is. This is often better for interviews than for questionnaires because people are more likely to talk than to write. If you have an open-ended text box, you'll find that people are a lot less likely to type in it or to type much information in it. However, when people do respond, this does allow for much more detailed, rich, and unique answers, so you can get a better idea for what's going on in your given topic. There is the risk that answers will be unclear, ambiguous, or off topic, because if it's a survey, you don't see them until they've already taken it. And also, answers have to be summarized using qualitative data analysis, which we talked about is much more time consuming than quantitative. So it's really preferable to use open-ended questions when you don't know enough about a certain topic or there isn't enough out there in the research to even know what questions to ask. So maybe you can't even form a hypothesis because you still need to gather more information about a particular phenomenon or experience. This is the same as the distinction between when to use quantitative and when to use qualitative. Really, qualitative is best when we're just starting to explore a topic and we don't even know enough yet to create a hypothesis. But we can ask great questions and learn more about that experience. Unlike in therapy, closed-ended questions are typically better for surveys. Respondents are given pre-selected choices, and then the researcher can summarize and analyze the responses to these choices. So this is quantitative data analysis. We can take a lot of information and reduce it down into something that's digestible, that makes sense. However, when you are creating these pre-selected responses to a closed-ended question, the options have to be exhaustive. So are all possible answers included there? And they have to be mutually exclusive so that people can choose between one or the other and not feel like they would want to choose more than one answer or should choose more than one answer. An exception to this is if you're allowing respondents to choose multiple answers. A great example of the difficulties in asking closed-ended questions is when it comes to asking about race or ethnicity. And there is an example of this in the census. So historically, the census has asked about race and ethnicity in separate questions. You'll see here on the left the existing question as it was asked in 2010. You'll see they ask in question 8 about ethnicity, which they're asking about Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish ethnicity or not. And then in number 9, they're asking about race. Now, what they noticed in the responses to these questions is that a growing number of respondents did not choose a racial category. About 6.2% chose some other race, and the majority of those respondents also reported that they were Hispanic. Now, 6.2% choosing some other race sounds like a small number, but for the census, which is attempting to describe and paint a picture of the entire country, 6.2% is a lot to not have clear information on. So they proposed a new question, which you'll see here on the right, that combines these questions about race and ethnicity into one question. So you'll see now we have white, black, Hispanic, Native American, Asian, Native Hawaiian, and then some other race. So by putting them in one question, it allows a person who identifies as Hispanic or Latino to choose that as their race or ethnicity and only choose that, and not be forced to choose white, black, Native American, or Asian, which may not be salient for them. They've piloted this new question, and in that pilot, remember I said earlier, if you're going to design a survey, you have to pilot it to see how it works. In their pilot, only 1% of respondents chose some other race. So my guess is, and I of course don't know this for sure, is that in the 2020 census, they will use this new category. Now, if you're looking at these categories, I'm sure you notice that there are lots of issues or concerns with race and ethnicity and how we define it, and the boxes that we literally ask people to check. But for now, this is an example of the clarity of your question determining if you get valid responses or not. And in this case, the census isn't getting valid responses because they're not asking a question in a way that resonates for people. You may also notice that they switched the way they asked the question from on the left, where there were check boxes to answer the type of Hispanic or Latino origin that you were, and also to indicate the type of Asian you are. I mean, even as I'm describing this, these questions just seem ridiculous. But you move to the right, and you see that now there are check boxes for each race plus Hispanic or Latino, and then an open text box for each of those for people to write in their specific race or country of origin or ethnicity. So while people are still asked to choose a box, they are then allowed the opportunity to describe themselves in their own words. A common type of closed-ended question that we have already discussed at length this semester is a Likert type question or a Likert type scale. And the thing to think about when you're using a Likert type scale is how many choices do you give in your range of responses. Typically, it's between 5 to 7. You can see that 3 choices might be insufficient and 10 choices might be a little much. Particularly if we're looking at strongly disagree to strongly agree, I'm not sure there's a distinct difference between 3 and 4 or 6 and 7. The other thing to decide when you're doing a Likert type question is, do you give a middle option? Do you give a neutral or an undecided option? And some researchers will choose not to give that because they want to force a response in one direction or another. Because you don't have the opportunity to explain closed-ended questions to respondents, you have to be clear and specific in your questions so that you get consistent, reliable responses. For example, if you're going to ask a question about income, you need to be specific. What do you mean? Is that by paycheck? Is that by week, by month, by year? Is that an individual person? Is that a household income? Avoid jargon or language that people might not understand. If you're going to ask questions about therapeutic alliance, you probably wouldn't use the word alliance because it's something that we commonly use, but not something that's used in most people's day-to-day life in the way that we mean it. You also want to avoid double negatives because those are just confusing. This is an example from a measure I used in my dissertation. In a disaster, women ought not necessarily to be rescued before men. I'll say that again. In a disaster, women ought not necessarily to be rescued before men. So this is a question on a sexism inventory, and what it's asking is basically, should women be rescued before men? But it's phrased in a double negative way, so that it's quite confusing. And I wound up throwing out this question because it was not reliable with the other items on that inventory. And I can understand why. You also want to avoid double-barreled questions. And we talked about this in class as well, where there are two parts to the question, and people have to either agree with both or disagree with both. And it leaves out people who may agree with one but not the other. Another example for my dissertation: even though I'm very close to my mother, I feel like I can be myself. So here, the respondent has to first agree with the idea that they are very close to their mother, and then determine if they can be themselves or not. So if somebody doesn't feel close to their mother, then they're stuck in a position where they can't actually answer the question. Another thing to avoid, both in therapy and in creating surveys, is to avoid leading questions. So avoid asking a question that's going to lead the participant to a particular answer. In this sample we have here on the screen, it says, question number 10, how much danger do you think liberty is in right now as a result of President Obama's policies, actions, and agenda for America's future? Mark as many answers as you think appropriate. So here's not one where we're forcing a response, but we are leading a response. First option, more serious than the threats we faced in World War II from Nazi Germany and the Japanese, because the attack on liberty today is from our own government. More serious than the threat we faced from the Soviet Union during the Cold War. More serious than the American Civil War. All of the above. Serious, but not as serious as the threats to liberty listed above. President Obama is not an enemy of liberty. And then you have the option to say you are undecided, or to fill in your own response about how much danger liberty is in because of President Obama. So as you can see, given that the first four options are rather dramatic, this question is leading someone to respond in a way that indicates liberty is in danger. The other thing to think about when you're asking close-ended questions is loading questions about undesirable behavior. This is another thing that is very helpful in therapy. So that is, if you're going to ask a question where people might think they should respond in a certain way and that they're shamed to respond in another way, then we can normalize it before we ask it. So for example, if you ask people, did you vote in the November election? People may think, oh, you're supposed to vote, but I didn't vote. So if they didn't vote, they may lie. However, if you load it and normalize, then you may be more likely to get an honest response. So a better way to ask it, in talking to people about elections, we find that a lot of people were not able to vote because they weren't registered, they were sick, or they just didn't have the time. How about you? Did you vote in the election this November? Here, people may be more likely to be honest if they didn't vote, because now you've normalized that a lot of people don't vote. This is something to keep in mind when asking about substance use, infidelities, conflict, anything in therapy where you may be afraid to ask your clients because you don't want to offend them or you don't want them to lie or be embarrassed. First of all, that's something for you to work on. But second of all, you can also normalize that these are things that people do, and this is normal. And then people are more likely to be honest with you about what's really going on in their lives. And finally, you want to keep in mind the limits of memory recall. How far back are you asking people to remember when you ask them questions? Finally, when you are reading journal articles with surveys in them, how do you evaluate the surveys and the methodology? So researchers rarely append surveys to an article. They're usually far too long and it's just not necessary. So you're not often going to get to see the actual survey that someone took. Instead, what you can do is evaluate the rigor of any sample questions that they provide in the methods section, how they piloted the survey or how they trained their interviewers, how good are their sampling methods, how good is their external validity. Most often, they're going to be using established measures and instruments. So what's the reliability and validity of those? And if they created their own, then they also should report the reliability and validity of those. The statistical analyses that they use and the findings that they use, and also the appropriateness of the conclusions drawn, keeping in mind that survey research is rarely longitudinal and can rarely be used to demonstrate cause and effect. Researchers should be aware of that when they're summarizing their results and talking about what their results mean for the real world. And in class, you'll have an opportunity to look at a journal article about a survey study and evaluate its rigor and look at some of the components that made up the study. Thank you for your rapt attention.